The crowd froze when they heard the snap. It wasn't just sound. It was sensation, the dry crack of bone meeting force, carried through the mats and straight into the gut of every person in the gym. For one instant, time stuttered. The smell of sweat and disinfectant hung motionless, and all the noise, the cheers, the clapping, the shouts, collapsed into stunned silence. It was supposed to be a small tournament. Folding chairs lined the edges of the high school gymnasium, fluorescent lights buzzing faintly above the tatami laid down on the wooden floor. Parents clutched phones, trying to capture their kids' matches for posterity. Friends shouted encouragement between rounds, the kind of local event where everyone pretends it's casual until pride turns it into something heavier. On the mat had stood two fighters. One was a boy, thin but wiry, maybe 17. His GI sleeves were a little too long, his belt faded but tied with care. His eyes burned with the reckless brightness of someone who hadn't yet learned fear. Across from him loomed a man with a black belt knot at his waist. Broad shoulders, calm arrogance, the casual looseness of someone used to winning. He'd entered the bracket for reasons no one questioned aloud. Maybe to tune up, maybe to prove a point. The match started fast, the boy darting in with desperate energy, trying to move before thinking. The black belt met him with a smile that wasn't kindness. He caught grips easily, shook off scrambles with disdain, speaking under his breath as they rolled. Too slow, too soft. The boy fought anyway, cheeks flushed, jaw tight, giving every ounce of what he had. Spectators leaned forward, some laughing at the mismatch, others muttering that the pairing shouldn't have happened at all. The black belt made sure they noticed him. He exaggerated every escape, every counter, throwing glances toward the audience as if to say, "This is what real fighting looks like." Then, in a blink, it shifted. The boy tried an armbar, clumsy but committed. For a flicker, the crowd believed in him, but the black belt rolled through, trapped the boy's arm against his chest, and cranked hard. Too hard. The snap was loud enough to silence the gym. The boy cried out and collapsed onto the mat, clutching his arm bent at the wrong angle. The referee dove in, waving his arms frantically. But the sound of the bone breaking had already declared the match over. Gasps ripped through the audience. A few chairs clattered as people stood. Phones dropped. A mother screamed and ran forward, shoes squealing on the floor. The gym, which only moments earlier had been noisy with chatter, was now a storm of confusion, shouts of "Get help!" mixing with stunned silence. And in the middle of it stood the black belt, arms raised like a champion. He didn't look at the boy writhing on the mat. He turned to the crowd, grinning, and shouted, "This is real fighting, not kids' play." The words sliced deeper than the snap. Half the gym booed, voices raw. The other half, stunned into shock, stayed silent. A few clapped half-heartedly, not from admiration but out of disbelief at the audacity. The boy's mother knelt beside her son, whispering his name, while others tried to help her lift him. The sound of his sobs carried across the mats, breaking whatever illusion of sport had remained. It no longer felt like a tournament. It felt like a trial. The spectators weren't just watching. They were judging, every glare and every whispered curse, turning the air into a jury box. And then, just as the shouting swelled, something shifted. From the back rows of folding chairs, a figure rose. Slowly, without drama, without words. Heads turned as he stepped into the aisle. The noise dimmed on its own, as if people instinctively knew to quiet down. A hush rolled through the gym, stronger than any referee's whistle. He walked with steady steps, plain jeans, a shirt tucked loosely at the waist. No entourage, no spotlight. His presence alone carved a path forward, and people moved aside without thinking. It was Chuck Norris. Not the meme, not the punchline. The man. His hair gray, his face lined, his stride deliberate. He didn't rush. He didn't need to. His eyes fixed on the mat, on the boy curled in pain, then on the man still smirking in victory. The gym, full of voices seconds before, dropped into suffocating silence. The only sound was the boy's cries and the squeak of Chuck's boots on the polished wood as he approached the tatami. And in that silence, every person in the room felt it. Whatever was about to happen would not be sport, not performance. It would be something heavier, something real. Just wondering, where are you watching from? Write it down, bellow. The boy's scream tore through the gym like a siren. He clutched his arm, bent at a wrong angle, his body curling against the mat. His mother burst from the bleachers, nearly tripping as she sprinted, her voice breaking as she called his name. She knelt beside him, hands trembling, afraid to touch, afraid not to. Around them, the world fractured. Parents gasped, kids cried, phones shook in unsteady hands. Volunteers hurried forward with a first aid kit that looked more like a prop than a lifeline. The referee waved frantically, voice cracking as he begged the crowd to step back. The air reeked of sweat and antiseptic. But now it carried something sharper, the metallic edge of fear. And in the middle of it, the black belt raised his arms. He looked straight into the stands, grinning. "This is real fighting," he shouted, his voice thick with triumph. "Not kids' play." The words detonated. One half of the room booed instantly, harsh and guttural, while a few clapped half-heartedly, as though they couldn't decide whether they were impressed or horrified. Someone yelled, "Coward!" Another voice, sharp and furious, cut across the noise. "He's just a boy." The mother pressed her forehead against her son's temple, whispering to him, trying to quiet his sobs. A stranger slid his jacket under the injured arm for support. The boy's breathing came ragged, gasping, like each inhale was a battle. In the stands, a child began to cry, a high, confused wail in a dinosaur hoodie. The sound pierced the chaos, throwing an uncomfortable hush across the room. Adults who had been shouting lowered their voices, embarrassed to be louder than a child. The black belt strutted a small circle, sweat gleaming on his shoulders. He bowed mockingly, then pointed to himself as though daring the crowd to admire him. The smirk stayed fixed, but it had started to look forced. "Enough!" An older man barked from the bleachers, his voice cutting through the din. "Sit him down." His words weren't aimed at the boy. They were meant for the winner. For the first time, the black belt blinked. The announcer fumbled with the microphone, producing a painful screech before dropping it in defeat. Without an official voice to take control, the crowd governed itself. Shouts ebbed into uneasy murmurs. The boos softened and a heavy expectation settled. It started quietly. A man rose from the back row of folding chairs. No fanfare, no words. He stepped into the aisle with calm certainty. People turned instinctively, then shifted aside as if pulled by an unseen current. Cameras on phones swiveled toward him, capturing the moment from shaky angles. Conversations snapped shut. Even the black belt's grin faltered, his eyes narrowing as if he'd sensed a change in the room's gravity. The figure walked slowly down the aisle. Jeans faded at the knees, boots scuffed from use, a dark shirt under a plain jacket. No uniform, no badge of authority. Just presence. His hair was silver at the temples, his face worn but steady. He didn't stride like a showman. He moved like a man who knew there was no need to rush. Chuck Norris. Recognition spread without anyone shouting it. It moved like a wave. First a murmur, then silence, the kind that doesn't need to be ordered. The gym, moments ago loud enough to rattle the rafters, quieted until only the boys' cries filled the air. Chuck didn't look at the black belt. Not yet. He walked straight to the mat, crouched beside the injured boy, and placed one hand lightly on his shoulder. His voice was low but firm, and the microphones dangling above caught it perfectly. "Breathe," he said. "In through your nose. Easy, look at me." The boy's wild panic steadied for a beat, his eyes fixing on the calm presence above him. His breath, still ragged, slowed enough to matter. His mother glanced up, her lips trembling, and for the first time since the snap, her face showed a flicker of relief. Only then did Chuck lift his head. The black belt smirked again, louder this time, trying to force bravado back into the air. "What's this?" he scoffed, voice pitched for the crowd. "Some old cowboy here to teach me manners?" A few people laughed nervously, but the sound died quickly. Others hissed. Most just waited, eyes darting between the two men, sensing that the room had shifted into something more dangerous than sport. Chuck didn't answer him. He looked at the boy once more and spoke softly, but the entire gym seemed to lean in. "You fought with honor," he said. "That's worth more than his victory." The words cut deeper than any insult. They weren't meant to entertain, and they weren't meant for the black belt. They were meant for the boy and for everyone else watching. Silence followed, thick and undeniable. The crowd, which had been buzzing with noise seconds earlier, fell completely still. The weight of the statement landed like stone. The black belt's grin wavered. He rolled his shoulders as if preparing to fight again, but for the first time, his eyes betrayed something else. Doubt. Sweat slid down his jaw. His tongue pressed against his teeth. The officials finally arrived, kneeling to help the boy off the mat. Chuck stepped aside, giving them room. He didn't direct, didn't command. He simply moved one pace back, and somehow that single gesture spoke louder than the referee's frantic orders. The crowd reformed around the moment. Men who had been yelling folded their arms and went quiet. Teenagers lowered their phones, holding them steady, realizing this wasn't just footage of a tournament anymore. The black belt shifted his stance, eyes flicking between Chuck and the crowd. Chuck looked at him at last, not with anger, not even with challenge, just a steady, level gaze that carried the weight of inevitability. And for the first time all night, the black belt didn't look sure of himself. The volunteers carried the boy off the mat. His mother bent low beside him, whispering as if words could dull pain. The crowd gave way, a narrow aisle opening through the folding chairs. People's faces followed, guilty, shaken. Phones lowered. What had started as a tournament now felt more like an accident everyone had helped cause. Chuck stayed where he was until the boy cleared the edge of the tatami. Then he rose, calm and steady, eyes on the black belt who still lingered in the center. The man wiped sweat from his face, forcing a grin. "You all saw it," he called. "He tapped late. That's not on me." His voice cracked slightly, but he covered it with volume, spreading his arms to the bleachers. The laugh that answered him was thin and uneasy. Chuck stepped closer, just to the tape line at the mat's edge. He didn't cross it. He didn't have to. The referee, jittery, moved between them. "Back to your seats, sir," he said, soft but pleading. Chuck didn't argue. He simply stood, a still point the whole room orbited. The black belt tried again. "What's this? An old cowboy telling me about honor?" He wanted to laugh, but the words hung heavy. Chuck crouched, touched the mat where the boy had fallen, then straightened. His gaze found the mother seated by the wall, still cradling her son's hair. He nodded once, small, deliberate. Then he turned back. "You fought a child like you were proving a debt," he said evenly. "He fought you like it was still about learning." His tone wasn't accusation, just fact. "I know what I saw." The gym stilled. The crowd leaned forward in their seats. Even the HVAC hum seemed louder in the pause. The black belt chuckled nervously. "Respect doesn't win matches," he said, trying to sound amused. "Pressure does." Chuck took one step forward, still outside the mat. His eyes stayed fixed. "He fought with honor," he repeated, quiet but sharp. "That's worth more than your victory." The phrase struck harder than a shout. People shifted, folding their arms, dropping their phones lower. A few murmured in agreement. The black belt's smirk slipped for the first time. "You think you scare me?" he barked, but the words lacked weight. Sweat ran along his jaw. Chuck didn't blink. I don't need to scare you. I just need you to hear yourself, and so did they. He tilted his head slightly toward the bleachers. All eyes turned, parents, kids, strangers, faces lined with doubt, anger, or shame. The black belt's grin faltered again. He opened his hands, searching for the crowd's approval. This is contact sport. He knew what he signed up for. Chuck answered without raising his voice. He signed up to learn. You signed up to be seen. The line fell like a hammer. No applause, no boos. Just silence that stretched until even the children hushed. The referee glanced helplessly at the director, who shook his head. Nobody wanted to intervene. The black belt tried one last time, pointing to the tape between them. Then step in. Teach me. Chuck didn't move. You already taught yourself, he said. I only named it. The crowd felt the shift. This wasn't about points or brackets anymore. It was about truth, spoken plainly, and the fact that no trophy could outweigh it. From the hallway came the faint wail of sirens. An ambulance at last. The sound bled through the cinder-block walls, a reminder of the cost already paid. The referee turned toward the doors. The black belt didn't. Chuck did. And the entire gym, parents and children, fighters and fans, held its breath, suspended in the question of what would happen next, mercy or something nobody could undo. The black belt couldn't let silence linger. He puffed up his chest, voice booming like he wanted to drown out doubt. What's next, cowboy? He jeered, words sharp and ugly. Gonna show me some movie tricks? The taunt ignited the bleachers. One side erupted in boos, the other in nervous laughter. Parents stood halfway out of their seats, shouting over one another. Teenagers angled their phones higher, red record dots glowing in the dim light. Some voices tried to cheer him on, but they cracked under the weight of others screaming for fairness. The gym had stopped being a tournament. It was something more primal now, half trial, half spectacle. Chuck remained still. His boots kissed the tape at the edge of the mat. His arms were loose, his posture steady, his gaze fixed. He didn't react to the noise. When he finally spoke, the words cut through everything like glass sliding across stone. Strength without respect, he said, slow and plain, isn't strength at all. It landed harder than a punch. The black belt's grin faltered. His shoulders twitched as if struck. The crowd fell quiet in a ripple, one row after another, until the sound became a heavy hush. Someone whispered, "Did you hear that?" And the words seemed unnecessary. Everyone had. The black belt forced a laugh. "Then prove it," he barked, voice too loud, too sharp. He jabbed his finger at the center of the mat, eyes blazing. "Right here, right now." The gym inhaled as one creature. A boy in the top row dropped his soda. The plastic clatter echoed like a gunshot. Parents grabbed their children closer, but nobody looked away. Folding chairs squealed as people stood, trying to see better. The air itself thickened, charged with the kind of anticipation that hurts the chest. The referee scrambled into the gap, palms raised. "This is not sanctioned," he shouted, words cracking with panic. "This is not part of the program." But his protest sounded thin, meaningless. The crowd wasn't listening. The crowd wanted blood, or at least proof. The black belt fed on it. He bounced on his toes, slapped his shoulders, tried to wear arrogance like armor. "Come on, legend," he sneered, voice dripping sarcasm. "Teach me." Chuck didn't step in. He glanced past the fighter toward the boy now sitting by the wall, wrist bound in a makeshift splint, his head resting on his mother's shoulder. Even from across the gym, the boy's eyes clung to him. Chuck gave him a small nod, so small it might have been missed if you weren't looking. The boy blinked, and for a heartbeat his breathing steadied. Then Chuck looked back to the mat, and this time he moved. The tape bent under his boots. He stepped onto the tatami. No rush, no swagger. The sound of rubber against canvas was almost lost in the hum of fluorescent lights, but everyone heard it. The entire room tilted with that step. Phones lifted higher. Adults pressed shoulders together for vantage. A woman near the aisle whispered, "Oh my God," though whether in fear or awe was unclear. The referee shook his head, hands trembling, but even he stepped aside. The black belt barked a laugh, too loud, too eager. He slapped his own cheeks, rolled his neck. Sweat shone on his brow. He spat once to the side, then squared his stance. "Demonstration only, huh?" he mocked. "Fine by me." Chuck's entry couldn't have been more different. No stance, no noise, just measured steps, arms relaxed, eyes steady. He carried no weight of proving himself. He carried only presence, and that alone pressed heavier than any boast. The crowd thickened into one organism. Heat rose, mixing with the bitter tang of sweat, the sterile burn of disinfectant, the faint sweetness of spilled soda. Somewhere a child whimpered, then hushed, sensing what was at stake. Even those who had jeered earlier were quiet now, as if they too felt history pressing down on them. The black belt shuffled, tested his footing. He threw a feint, quick and sharp, testing Chuck's reaction. Chuck didn't move. His breath was steady, shoulders loose, gaze level. The silence before the storm was unbearable. A man muttered, "He's not even ready," only to be shushed immediately. The black belt smirked again, though it didn't reach his eyes. "Right here," he hissed, pointing to the mat. "Right here," Chuck echoed, calm as granite. And with those words, the room collapsed into a single point of focus. Phones buzzed, hearts pounded, the fluorescent hum turned into background static. The referee's voice faltered into nothing. The black belt moved first. The black belt shot forward like a sprinter leaving the blocks, arms reaching for collar and sleeve. No test, no feint. He went all in, banking on shock and speed. Canvas squealed beneath his boots, echoing in the gym's rafters. The crowd gasped in unison, dozens of lungs catching air, the sound louder than applause. Chuck didn't block, didn't stiff-arm. He turned. His weight shifted just enough to let the force pass him like wind around a rock. Fingers closed on GI fabric and found it slipping out of range, momentum dying on empty space. The black belt stumbled, hit it with a sharp grin, but his eyes darted for half a second. An instinctive flicker that betrayed the stumble. "Keep it," the referee tried to bark, but his words cracked and fell flat. He knew better than to try to police what had already left the boundaries of a tournament. The second entry came faster, angrier. Level change, head to hip, hands laced behind a thigh, a perfect double-leg shot. The kind drilled 1,000 times to send men flying. Chuck's hands dropped, one to crown, one to wrist. Barely any pressure. He redirected, carving a lane that hadn't existed a second earlier. Instead of driving through, the younger fighter spilled sideways, landing on one knee, canvas thudding. He popped up quickly, cheeks red, feigning a smile as though nothing had happened. Up in the bleachers, the old grapplers went silent, the kind of silence men use when they recognize mastery. Parents gripped the edges of their seats. The dinosaur hoodie kid pressed his face into the railing, eyes wide, no longer crying. The black belt slapped his thighs, trying to restart his rhythm. He lashed out with a probing low kick, boots scuffing against canvas. Chuck shifted half a foot, absorbing the line without effort. It looked simple, too simple, and that was the point. "Move!" a voice shouted from the crowd, but it wasn't clear to whom. The third rush carried real heat. A collar tie snapped around Chuck's neck, the younger fighter trying to yank his head into a rising knee. Chuck tilted, spine still straight, forearm floating into place like a frame. The knee blasted air but missed the target. The crowd hissed, then laughed in disbelief. A single clap echoed from the top row, then stopped, embarrassed by its own loneliness. "Demonstration," the referee pleaded. But nobody was listening. The black belt tried to assert himself with a body lock. His arms cinched tight around Chuck's torso, knuckles digging into GI fabric. He drove forward, chest to chest, jaw set. It should have been crushing. It wasn't. Chuck's elbows sank, hips withdrew an inch, spine a steel post. The pressure looped back into the black belt himself, forcing him into 2 ugly backward steps before he broke the hold. The booze came now, directed at him, not Chuck. Chuck remained still, his expression unreadable. No grin, no fury, just steady presence, which proved heavier than muscle. "Do something!" The black belt spat, sweat dripping from his chin. His voice cracked against the noise of the crowd. He dove again, hands low, shooting for a single-leg takedown. Here, finally, Chuck touched him with intent. His palm guided the skull, his other hand captured the wrist, hip spiraling in a way so small it almost looked like stillness. The drive collapsed into a kneel, the kneel into imbalance. Suddenly, the younger fighter was folded at an angle he hadn't chosen. Chuck's forearm pressed gently across his chest, the other hand pinning triceps. His movement created a hinge where pain could begin, but didn't. He held it perfectly still, like a surgeon placing a scalpel and then refusing to cut. The crowd froze. Phones steadied in the air. Even the restless shuffling of children stopped. Chuck leaned down just enough for the microphones to catch the words. "This ends," he said, calm, deliberate, "when you choose to respect, not destroy." The black belt's face flushed crimson. His teeth ground together, breath sawing through his nose. His hands clawed at air, searching for leverage. None came. Around them, the crowd leaned forward, so close they might topple out of the bleachers. From the hallway, the wail of an ambulance siren filtered in, a sound both distant and near, as though it had arrived for this very moment. It sliced through the silence, reminding everyone of the boy carried out minutes earlier. The black belt jerked once, testing. Chuck adjusted without adding pressure, keeping the hinge firm but painless. The test turned into stillness. Pride screamed inside him, but the body knew what the mind didn't want to say. He was caught, not by force, but by control. His eyes darted to the crowd, no support there, to the boy against the wall, pale, arms splinted, watching without flinching. Then to Chuck, whose gaze didn't carry anger, only demand, respect. The younger man's shoulders sank. His breath rattled. Fingers flexed once, then curled against the mat in a motion halfway between a tap and resignation. The crowd didn't cheer. They held their breath, unwilling to interrupt what felt larger than a match. Chuck released him instantly. He stepped back a pace, hands open, body relaxed. Not triumph, not humiliation, just release. The black belt stayed kneeling too long, chest heaving, face blotched. When he rose, he adjusted his GI like a man trying to find dignity in cloth. His eyes stayed low, avoiding everyone's. Silence stretched. The crowd didn't know whether to applaud or stay quiet. It was the kind of silence that weighs more than sound, filled with awe and unease. Finally, a slow ripple of clapping began, hesitant, then stronger, then breaking into waves. But it wasn't the celebration of a knockout. It was acknowledgement. Across the room, the boy's mother pressed her forehead to his hair, eyes wet. The boy, pale but awake, whispered something too soft to catch, but his lips formed a single word: respect. The referee, shaking, raised a hand weakly. That's the demonstration," he said, as though his words could explain what had just been witnessed. They couldn't. Chuck's eyes lingered on the younger fighter one last time. He didn't say more. He didn't need to. The message had already been carved into the silence. True strength isn't in how hard you hit, but in what you choose to hold back. And the crowd understood, even if they would argue about it later. Even if the footage would be replayed 1,000,000 times online. In that gym, in that moment, everyone knew they had seen something real. Something that couldn't be faked, bought, or sold. The black belt lingered on one knee, breath ragged, fist pressed to the mat like it might steady him. When he rose, too fast, he wobbled and yanked at his GI, trying to fix dignity with cloth. The gym didn't jeer or cheer. It simply waited. Silence pressed heavier than any scoreboard. Applause began in pockets, soft and hesitant, spreading in slow waves. It wasn't victory cheers. It was acknowledgement, agreement with something everyone had seen but couldn't name. The dinosaur hoodie kid whispered, "He didn't hurt him," and the phrase threaded through the hush like a truth bigger than commentary. The medics entered with their stretcher, wheels squeaking, equipment rattling. Behind them came the boy, pale but upright, his wrist strapped. His mother clutched his sleeve, lips tight with fear and pride. The crowd parted without being asked. All eyes followed as they reached the edge of the mat. Chuck stepped toward them. No pose, no gesture for cameras. He crouched slightly to the boy's level and said, "Just loud enough for mics to catch. You're stronger today than you were yesterday because you stood your ground." The boy nodded, his lower lip trembling but steadying. His mother broke into tears, gripping Chuck's hand with both of hers. Around the gym, people looked away from their phones and wiped at their eyes. Behind them, the black belt shifted. His face was blotched, breath uneven, pride collapsing under its own weight. Twice he opened his mouth, but words wouldn't come. On the third try, he managed, "I'm sorry." The words were quiet, uneven, but they landed harder than his earlier boasts. Nobody clapped this time. They let the words stand. Chuck didn't answer with triumph. He didn't scold. He simply gave silence back, letting the apology breathe without being cheapened. Sometimes mercy is not what you say, but what you leave unsaid. The boy's mother led him away, medics trailing, but not before the boy paused, placed his good hand over his chest, and glanced at Chuck. The nod Chuck returned was tiny, but it reached him. The mother squeezed Chuck's hand one last time before disappearing through the doors. The black belt bowed awkwardly, not showy, more like someone relearning how to bend for the right reason. Chuck inclined his head in acknowledgement. No winner, no loser. Just a moment no one in that gym would forget. The referee, shaky with relief, muttered something about demonstration complete. His words sounded hollow against what had just filled the air. The scoreboard stayed blank. The brackets would be scratched, but nobody cared. Phones kept recording, but the way people held them had changed. Arms were lower, frames wider. They weren't filming a fight anymore. They were trying to preserve the weight of what had passed between two men, a boy, and a room full of witnesses. Chuck crossed the mat slowly and sat back in the same chair he had risen from earlier. No parade, no raised hands. Just presence. The applause returned. Low, steady, respectful. Not the roar of a crowd, but the rhythm of recognition. The director finally lifted a microphone, then set it back down. All he managed was, "We'll take a break. Be kind to each other." He left it there because anything more would have spoiled the moment. People didn't rush the aisles. They stayed rooted, holding the silence even after Chuck had left the mat. Some hugged quietly, others whispered to their children. A few simply sat, heads lowered like they had been in church. Chuck smoothed a strip of peeling mat tape near the corner before leaving. He nodded once to the kid in the dinosaur hoodie, who nodded back with the seriousness of someone who had just grown older in minutes. Then Chuck stepped through the doors without looking back. The gym finally exhaled. Not in relief, not in victory, but in the awareness that they had witnessed something real. A truth too heavy for brackets, too sharp for highlight reels. Later, videos would flood online. Headlines would spin it into stories. But the people in that room would always tell it differently. They would remember not the moves or the standoff, but the silence, the apology, the lesson. They would say it wasn't about who was stronger. It was about who chose to be.